All right, let's dive right into this. Today, we're unpacking some incredibly complex source material that traces the absolute meteoric rise of BlackRock. We're looking at exactly how it went from a small, relatively unknown Wall Street startup to an unprecedented global powerhouse that fundamentally shapes the modern world we live in. Whether you're deeply entrenched in high finance or just somebody trying to figure out who's actually pulling the levers of the global economy, we're going to break down their exact playbook. We'll look closely at the data, the history, and the highly strategic moves that got them to where they are today.
$68 trillion. I mean, that's a number that is almost too massive to even wrap your head around, right? But according to our sources, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink has a $68 trillion endgame in his sights. That number represents the projected global demand for infrastructure investment by the year 2040. But to really understand how a single company could even position itself to orchestrate a financial takeover of that magnitude, we've got to go back in time. We actually have to start not with a massive success, but with a pretty catastrophic error back in the 1980s.
Section 1. The $100 million mistake. Let's rewind the clock to 1976. A young, super ambitious Larry Fink arrives on Wall Street and joins the prestigious investment bank First Boston. And he isn't just playing the market, he is a pioneer. He starts making absolute millions for his firm by developing what was, at the time, a really obscure and highly profitable financial product.
That product was the mortgage-backed security, or MBS. The source material actually uses a perfect phrase for this. They call it a financial casserole. Essentially, you mix a whole bunch of home loans together, bake them into a single product, and then slice them up to sell to investors. Think basically package the American dream of homeownership into complex fixed-income instruments. And this brilliant, though incredibly risky innovation rocketed him to managing director at First Boston in absolute record time.
But you know, flying that high, that fast, it comes with some intense danger. The source details how Fink, who was determined to lock in his path to the CEO position, took a massive gamble on interest rates. He thought they were going to rise. Well, they plunged. And a single devastating numerical miscalculation on his financial insurance, his hedge, cost First Boston $100 million literally overnight. It was a failure so spectacular that it just completely destroyed his reputation and left him jobless.
Fink's own reflection on that era is pretty wild. He later admitted, and I quote, "We had no idea why we were making so much money. We had just extraordinary risk. But that profound, humiliating failure, that birthed BlackRock in 1988. Fink took that trauma and vowed to become the absolute master of managing risk. He realized that whoever controlled the risk controlled the entire game."
Which brings us to Section 2, the engine of finance. This total obsession with risk management didn't just change how Larry Fink invested. It led to the creation of a secret weapon. A weapon that our sources argue is the true foundation of BlackRock's unprecedented global reign.
That weapon is a computerized risk management system called Aladdin. Described by our sources as the Windows of global finance, what started out as an internal tool to simulate risk scenarios became so essential that today it's relied upon not just by BlackRock to manage its own massive portfolio, but by its fiercest competitors, firms like Vanguard and State Street. Even public institutions like the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank use it. They are all plugging right into the exact same machine. And the sheer scale here is just staggering. By 2020, Aladdin was tracking a mind-blowing $21 trillion in assets. It acts as this completely unregulated central nervous system for roughly 10% of the globe's total financial assets. Just think about that. It's a single software platform dictating the flow of trillions, sitting entirely within BlackRock's control.
All right, Section 3, profiting from the crash. Let's fast forward to 2008 and see how this builds into their next massive leap. The 2008 financial crisis was the greatest financial disaster of a generation, which is deeply ironic, considering it was fueled by the very mortgage-backed securities that Larry Fink helped invent back in the 80s. But while the rest of Wall Street panicked and burned, BlackRock was insulated, thanks to Aladdin's early warnings, and they saw the ultimate opportunity.
The source details how Fink capitalized brilliantly on all that chaos. He scooped up Barclays Global Investors, including its absolute crown jewel, iShares, for $13.5 billion at a total bargain. This instantly made BlackRock the world's largest asset manager, dominating the booming market of passive ETFs. And suddenly, BlackRock held massive voting power across corporate America. Because they own shares on behalf of their clients, they hold immense sway over executive pay, layoffs, and board decisions, all while maintaining the relatively harmless legal status of a passive investor. And then, in an almost unbelievable twist, as the economy was literally crumbling, the bank of all banks came calling.
The U.S. Federal Reserve, absolutely desperate to untangle the mind-bending complexity of toxic mortgage assets, hired Larry Fink's team to write the actual playbook for the financial bailout. Yeah, the same man who pioneered the toxic assets blowing up the economy was now being paid to clean it up. This deeply cemented their influence directly inside the government's crisis response.
So what happens next is crucial. Section 4, writing the rules. After 2008, the government cracked down. Regulations tightened drastically with the Dodd-Frank Act to stop too-big-to-fail institutions from ever destroying the economy again. But BlackRock, despite being the single largest asset manager on Earth, managed to slip right through the regulatory net. How exactly does that happen?
The source material highlights a really key mechanism here, the revolving door. We're talking over 100 executives moving directly between BlackRock and top U.S. government institutions like the Treasury, the Fed, and the SEC. Regulators and officials from global governments frequently leave their public posts for really lucrative jobs at BlackRock. The source even points out that a former top BlackRock executive, Friedrich Merz, is now the Chancellor of Germany. Critics in the material strongly argue that this unprecedented lobbying blitz and constant exchange of personnel basically allows the firm to write its own rules and dodge strict oversight.
Moving on to Section 5, the ESG distraction. As you can imagine, with massive power comes massive scrutiny. As BlackRock became more visible, they faced intense public anger, particularly from environmental groups pointing out their heavy investments in fossil fuels. So to manage this PR crisis, BlackRock pivoted sharply to what the source calls the ESG distraction, rebranding themselves as the moral compass of Wall Street through environmental, social, and governance investing.
Fink was actually super blunt about this strategy, stating, "You have to force behaviors, and at BlackRock we are forcing behaviors." Our sources present this not necessarily as some sudden moral awakening, but as a highly calculated public relations move. It basically allowed them to charge premium management fees on newly painted green ETFs, all while using their massive voting power to threaten to pull funding from CEOs who didn't comply with the new standards.
But wow, did that strategy unravel quickly. BlackRock faced brutal political backlash from literally all sides. The left accused him of greenwashing and hypocrisy, noting they still held billions in oil. Meanwhile, the right accused him of woke capitalism, with states like Florida pulling $2 billion in protest. Facing that kind of dual pressure, Fink executed a very quiet retreat. By 2023, they exited the Net Zero Initiative, and by 2024, their support for climate shareholder proposals plunged to just 4%. Our sources note this retreat basically proved to critics that the ESG movement, at least for BlackRock, was largely just a temporary marketing spin.
Which brings us to Section 6, honestly, the most critical part of this whole explainer, the infrastructure endgame. With ESG fading as a viable marketing tool and the ETF market reaching saturation, BlackRock didn't just sit still. According to the source material, they initiated their most ambitious and potentially terrifying pivot yet. Our sources outline a massive shift in their core strategy here. For the last decade, they absolutely dominated financial assets. Abstract indexes, digital portfolios, things that exist entirely on computer screens. But now, they are pivoting hard to physical assets. Airports, power grids, water systems, trade routes. BlackRock is actively shifting away from abstract financial instruments that we can easily ignore and moving to take direct, monopolistic control over the physical infrastructure that modern civilization literally cannot survive without.
And the numbers and massive recent acquisitions totally back this up. The source data points to a $12.5 billion buyout of global infrastructure partners. They're brokering deals to secure control of critical ports at the Panama Canal. They've become the official gatekeeper of the Ukraine Development Fund to oversee the country's eventual post-war reconstruction. Critics in the source material find it deeply unsettling that BlackRock profits heavily from holdings in defense contractors during global conflicts, while simultaneously positioning itself to reap massive profits from the inevitable rebuilding efforts once the dust settles. Remember that $68 trillion figure from the beginning? This is exactly how they plan to capture it.
So how do they make sure this massive physical takeover is safe for their bottom line? The source breaks down a highly criticized approach known as the catalytic capital strategy. Step 1, public money guarantee. They leverage their government influence to get taxpayers to guarantee the capital for these huge projects. Step 2, private implementation. BlackRock executes the actual infrastructure or rebuilding projects. Step 3, risk-free returns. BlackRock and its investors pocket the massive profits, but if anything goes wrong, the public holds all the downside risk.
Our sources point out that this structure basically allows the firm to extract risk-free wealth from global conflicts and crumbling public works.
To wrap up this explainer, the source material leaves us with a really profound and chilling question. What actually happens to society when a single private corporation owns the bloodlines of modern civilization? When the water systems we drink from, the airports we fly out of, and the grids that power our homes fall into the hands of a private entity whose absolute primary mandate is delivering dividends to shareholders rather than maintaining public goods. If maintenance gets cut just to boost quarterly profits, we all pay the price. It's a fascinating look at the hidden architecture of our world, and it leaves us asking, moving forward, who is really in control of our future? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.